Nobody saw them coming. Nobody heard them leave. But in the hours that followed, the most powerful man in Iran sat behind fortified walls, surrounded by his most trusted guards, and still, he couldn't sleep. This is not a rumor. This is not propaganda. What you are about to hear is the account of a mission so precise, so devastating in its execution, that military analysts across the world went silent when the details began to surface. A mission that didn't just strike a target, a mission that sent a message written in fire, shadow, and speed. A message that landed directly on the desk of Ali Khamenei and told him something no one had dared to tell him in decades. You are not safe. Rewind to the months before it happened. Iranian intelligence had been growing bolder. Proxies across the Middle East were moving weapons, expanding influence, pressing boundaries. Tehran's leadership operated with a particular kind of confidence, the confidence of men who believed their geography protected them, who believed their air defense systems made them untouchable, who believed that any enemy foolish enough to enter Iranian territory would drown in the complexity of the terrain, the surveillance networks, the layered security architecture they had spent years building. They believed all of this. They were wrong. Inside the classified planning rooms of JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, a group of men had been studying Iran for a long time. Not in the way politicians study a country, through briefings and satellite imagery reviewed at breakfast. These men studied Iran the way a surgeon studies a body before an operation. They knew the roads. They knew the frequencies. They knew the patrol schedules, the guard rotations, the blind spots in every radar system protecting the targets that mattered most. Delta Force, officially known as 1st SFOD, is not the kind of unit that makes noise. They are not designed for headlines. They are designed for outcomes. And the outcome this time had to be flawless, because the operation being planned wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of operation that, if it failed, could change the geopolitical map of the entire region overnight. The mission parameters were extraordinarily tight. Insert quietly. Hit the objective. Extract completely. Leave nothing behind. No bodies, no equipment, no trace that Americans had ever set foot on Iranian soil. The window was measured not in hours, but in minutes. Every second over the planned timeline increased exposure. Every second over timeline was a second closer to catastrophe. The squad moved in before dawn, not through the front, not through any path that Iranian surveillance had ever flagged as a vulnerability. They moved through a gap so narrow, so carefully exploited, that the men who planned it had been working the problem for months before they found it. The insertion was cold and dark and precise. The men on the ground were not thinking about history or politics or what this mission meant in the larger picture. They were thinking about the next 30 seconds, then the 30 seconds after that. That is how Delta Force works, not in grand narratives, in 30-second blocks of controlled chaos. The first phase of the operation cleared without incident. Iranian patrols passed within meters of positions that were invisible. Guards rotated on schedule, a schedule that had been mapped, confirmed, and built into the operational timeline down to the individual breath. The men moved like water through rock, finding the path of least resistance, not because it was easy, but because they had made it easy through preparation so thorough it bordered on obsession. Then the objective came into view. What happened next is where the mission stopped being a textbook example of special operations execution and started being the kind of story that men with clearances tell in hushed voices years later. The target wasn't a single location. It was a network, interconnected, redundant, designed specifically to resist exactly this kind of attack. And the designers of that network had been confident in the way that people who have never faced Delta Force are always confident. The squad split, precisely as planned. Each element moving toward its assigned piece of the objective, with the coordination of a single organism that happened to be operating across multiple points simultaneously. Communication was minimal. These men had trained together long enough that silence carried meaning. A hand signal, a pressed earpiece, the absence of a transmission at a specific time, all of it was language. All of it was precision. The strikes were not loud. That is one of the things that surprised the Iranians most when they began to piece together what had happened. They expected fire and noise. They expected the American way of war they had seen on television, massive, overwhelming, theatrical. What they got instead was surgical removal, quiet, efficient. Like arriving in the morning to discover that something important has simply ceased to exist and not being able to explain how. Alarms triggered, but delayed. By the time the first Iranian security response was mobilizing, the squad had already completed 2 of the 3 primary objectives and was collapsing back toward the extraction point. The third objective, the hardest, the one that had caused the most debate in the planning rooms, was completed in a window so tight that the men involved have described it as the closest any of them have ever come to the edge. Close, but not over. The extraction was the part that separates myth from reality in this story. Because the Iranian response, once it activated fully, was significant, these were not poorly trained conscripts stumbling through darkness. These were Revolutionary Guard units, motivated, armed, operating on home territory with local knowledge and rage. They flooded the area. Checkpoints materialized. Aircraft were scrambled, and the squad was gone. Not neutralized, not suppressed, gone. As though the earth itself had swallowed them. As though they had never been there at all. Iranian commanders screaming into radios received no useful information, because there was no useful information to receive. The men they were hunting were already beyond reach, moving through corridors of safety that existed only because months of planning had created them. The debrief, conducted in a location that will not be named, lasted longer than the mission itself. That is how special operations works. The preparation is the mission. The execution is just the validation of the preparation. But the story doesn't end at the extraction point. The story ends in Tehran. Because when the full scope of what had happened became clear to Iranian intelligence, when they mapped the objectives that had been struck, when they understood the depth of penetration, when they realized that an American Special Operations Unit had moved through their most protected corridors without a single Iranian knowing until it was over, the implications were staggering. Ali Khamenei is a man who has spent decades projecting invulnerability. His authority rests on the perception that Iran, under his leadership, cannot be touched by its enemies, that its defenses are impenetrable, that its sacred geography cannot be violated. This perception is not just political, it is existential to his power. When people believe you are untouchable, they follow you. When that belief cracks, everything that rests on it begins to shift. The mission cracked it. Not publicly. There were no press releases. No official acknowledgements. The Iranian government did not go on television to explain what had happened. They couldn't. Admitting the penetration would have been more damaging than the penetration itself. So they said nothing. They sealed the information inside layers of classification. They rotated commanders. They quietly began the process of trying to understand how their systems had failed so completely. But Khamenei knew. His inner circle knew. And in that knowledge lived something that is perhaps more dangerous than any physical damage the mission inflicted. It lived in the question that none of them could answer with confidence anymore. If they did this once, what else have they done? What else are they doing right now? That question, that seed of doubt planted in the most fortified mind in the Islamic Republic, is the real outcome of the mission. Not the objectives struck, not the equipment destroyed or the networks disrupted. The real outcome is the psychological architecture it dismantled inside a room in Tehran, where a very powerful man sat with very trusted advisors and could not guarantee to any of them that his country was as protected as he had always claimed. Delta Force did not just execute a mission. They executed a message. The message was received. There is a reason the most elite special operations units in the world are not celebrated in the ways conventional military heroes are. It is not because their contributions are smaller. It is because their contributions operate in a register that conventional celebration cannot capture. They don't win battles, they reshape certainty. They take the things their adversaries believe to be fixed, geography, security, invulnerability, and they make them fluid. They make them questionable. When a man like Khamenei cannot sleep because he is no longer certain his walls are real, that is not a tactical victory. That is something deeper. That is the kind of result that echoes through every strategic decision his regime makes for years afterward. A hesitation, a recalculation, a margin of caution introduced into calculations that used to be made with total confidence. The men who did this will not be named here. They will not receive public medals for this specific operation. They will go back to their training, refine their skills, study the next problem with the same obsessive precision they brought to this one. They will not talk about it at dinner parties or explain it to their children in detail. They carry it in the quiet way that people carry things that are too large for ordinary words. But somewhere in the gap between what Iran's leadership says publicly and what they believe privately, the evidence of that mission lives, permanent, unanswered. A question carved into the confidence of an entire regime by a group of men who appeared out of darkness, completed the impossible, and vanished back into it before anyone could even confirm they were real. They appeared like a flash, and when they disappeared, they took with them something that cannot be replaced by any defense budget, or any new radar system, or any amount of Revolutionary Guard reinforcement. They took the certainty. And Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the man who has survived assassinations and wars and decades of international pressure, sat in his most secure room, surrounded by his most loyal guards, and understood something he had never truly understood before. He understood that being unreachable is not the same as being safe. The flash was real. The darkness it left behind was realer. And somewhere out there, those men are already studying the next problem.